Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this online panel session. This session is part of the One Basin CRC series addressing key topics in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's Basin Plan Review discussion paper. And today's session is all about supporting modernisation of water systems operations to achieve multiple benefits. My name's Seth Westra. I'm the Research Director of the One Basin CRC, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today on this really critically important topic for the basin. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin and their nations, and also any Indigenous people who are here with us today. I myself am joining from Kaurna country, the Adelaide Plains, a little bit outside of the basin, and I'd like to also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The One Basin CRC is fundamentally a collaboration across a broad partnership of industry, government, community and research organisations. We're supported by Commonwealth investment with matching partner contributions, and we exist to work together to grow value from water in a changing world. And here is a slide really showing the breadth of our different partners across sort of end user organisation, commercialisation partners and various knowledge agencies. And if you are from one of these partner organisations, I'd like to extend a particular welcome to you. So today's topic is all about water operations. We will start with the basics of what we mean by water operations and the evolution of things that operators have needed to take into account when making operational decisions. We'll delve into that decision-making environment in a little bit more detail then and start unpacking some of the key challenges associated with how we maximise the value that we get from every drop of water as we operate our systems. And finally, we'll try to conclude this really to talk about what this might mean for government policy and particularly the Basin Plan Review. This is a good time, I think, to highlight that the CRC, the One Basin CRC, is investing in a research project on reducing uncertainties and enabling multiple benefits in water delivery operations. This is a project that still has some way to run before it provides its final conclusions to us, but each of our panellists are in some way associated with that project, and you'll see some of the early findings from this project peppered throughout their responses. And this provides a perfect segue to introduce our panellists. So first, we have Serena Hamilton, who is a research fellow at the Australian National University in water resources management and socio-environmental systems modelling. And she is also the research lead for that multiple benefits project that I mentioned earlier. Next, we have Andrew Weston, who is the Chair of Hydrology and Water Resources at the University of Melbourne, and he has over 30 years of experience in catchment science. He is also a member of the Multiple Benefits Project team. Last but not least, we have the second of two Andrews, Andrew Reynolds, who is the Australian Dams leader at professional service firm GHD. He has over 30 years of experience in the management of major water supply infrastructure, river operations, as well as stakeholder engagement. He's also a former senior executive with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and so has first-hand experience managing the various competing priorities in the River Murray system. And Andrew is on the project advisory committee to that multiple benefits project, so not within the project team, but acting as a sort of independent advisor to that team. Now, the format today will be quite similar to other webinars in this series if you've attended previous webinars. Essentially, I'll be asking the panellists a few pre-prepared questions, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a broader Q&A at the end. So if any questions do come up for you, please do write them in the Q&A. I'll keep monitoring that throughout the discussion. And as I said, hopefully we'll have a bit of time to get to those. Please do use the Q&A function at the top of your screen, not the chat function. It's the Q&A that we'll be monitoring. So let's get right into it and let's start with some fundamental concepts. So for a first question for Andrew Reynolds. Today's topic is about modernising river operations to achieve multiple benefits. So what do we actually mean by river operations?
Thanks, Seth, and it's great to be here as part of this webinar today. But river operations is really about making sure the right amount of water is in the river at the right place at the right time to meet whatever requirements various entitlement holders and others have. And so it's an exercise in managing uncertainty and managing risk to achieve that. On the Murray system in particular, it takes a long time for water to make its way from the headwater storages particularly Hume Dam, which is the major storage, through the system to be available for environmental or irrigation purposes further downstream. For instance, water released at Hume takes the best part of 3 weeks to make its way down to Sunraysia. And so as a river operator, you've got to make decisions about what do you think the demands will be 2, 3, 4 weeks advance from when you're releasing that water to make it sure it's available at the right time. Now, irrigators, they want water at their pump or at their meter so that they can extract it from the river and use it for whatever purpose. Environmental water holders want to leave their water in the river, but they want the river to be at a level or at a flow rate that enables that water to get to whatever environmental areas that they're looking to get water onto. And so it's a combination of making sure you understand the extractive demands and making sure you understand the levels and making release decisions in light of uncertainty around what the weather might do between now and when that water is required. It might rain and there'll be more water in the river. It might turn really hot and extractions will be larger and then there'll be less water in the river. And obviously, once you've let water go from Hume Dam, you can't call it back. So you may be able to re-regulate it into Lake Victoria, or it might not be able to put there, and then it'll go through the system to the end. So it's really about managing those uncertainties. And river operations is the exercise of summing up all of those demands, all of those requirements, and making decisions about where releases are made from to be able to meet those in the future.
Well, thanks so much, and I think that really paints a picture of quite a complex operating environment for operators to make decisions. I might bring Serena you into this conversation because I know that you've been interviewing quite a number of different stakeholders that are involved in river operations in different ways. What have you learnt about, I guess, how operational decisions are made?
So in order to understand how multiple benefits can be enabled through water systems operations, our team has been engaging with a broad range of stakeholders from across the Southern Basin. So through interviews as well as workshops and other discussions. So this has included not only the river operators and irrigation infrastructure operators, but also some of the state government agencies involved in water planning and implementing the basin plan, the environmental water holders who hold water rights for the environment and decide how to use those entitlements to achieve ecological outcomes. There have been environmental managers who are also responsible for developing the seasonal environmental watering proposals, as well as representatives from local communities and First Nations groups. So while water systems operations involves the decisions about operating the infrastructure and delivering water, these decisions sit within the framework of water allocation and water management more broadly and are influenced by end users. So I'd like to show a diagram which illustrates how water governance in the Southern Connected Basin involves a very complex partnership between the Commonwealth and basin states to implement the basin plan and share water, so between the states and across water users. So the river operators and the irrigation infrastructure operators, so in the dark blue layer at the bottom, are then key to delivering water according to the rules and regulations prescribed by the states. So the end users, or the people, communities and industries of the basin, can also influence these decision making. So what we have is across these three scales, there are advisory committees and other mechanisms used to provide advice or seek feedback on plans, decisions and outcomes from experts, local community and increasingly First Nations groups. So there are a broad range of stakeholders that are somehow involved in water systems operations, and it is, however, quite a complex arrangement. So from speaking to the various stakeholders from different locations across the basin, it's clear that at the operational level, the involvement of different parties in water systems operations varies depending on whether, for example, the water is crossing jurisdictions, where or who the water is being delivered to. So for environmental water and cultural water deliveries, for instance, the operators generally have discussions with the respective water holders to understand how to best deliver their water orders to achieve their target outcomes. So how decisions are ultimately made in operations seems to vary on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Serena. And I mean, just from that diagram alone, you can already very quickly see just the range of different stakeholders are involved and sort of, I guess, somehow influencing those operational decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next question is for Andrew Weston. So the other part of today's session is about the multiple benefits piece. And we've already heard a little bit about, the irrigation water and the environmental water. And I guess putting that a little bit in historical context, when a lot of the infrastructure and systems were designed, they were really focused on irrigation as kind of the main demand, weren't they? But over the last couple of decades, you've sort of seen this emergence of environmental water, and we're also increasingly recognising the importance of cultural water now as well. Can you maybe sort of elaborate on some, what some of those types of developments might actually mean in practice for water operation? You're on mute, Andrew.
Thank you, Seth. The first thing that really comes up here is that you've now got several quite different sets of entitlement holders with quite different objectives. It's not just about getting water onto a paddock at the right time so your crop's not stressed. It's also about achieving environmental outcomes, often at a different part of the year to the main irrigation demands. It's about achieving cultural water outcomes, etc. We've had a really long history of irrigation, millennia. We've had a pretty long history of managing large dams and delivery systems, etc., for irrigation, at least a century. But we're really still pretty much in our infancy in terms of environmental water management and cultural water management. With these multiple objectives comes the potential for conflicts and conflicting objectives where you end up with situations where perhaps both stakeholders need to give a little bit. Probably at the moment, the momentum of that long history of irrigation demands perhaps means that the operating approaches still revert a little bit to the irrigation side. You've also got opportunity for synergy. As we transfer water, Andrew Reynolds talked a minute ago about transferring water right down the Murray system. Some of that water is transferred down in spring and you can achieve environmental benefits out of that. So if you get that coordination really working well, you can get some nice synergies. So really multiple benefits is really about trying to make the system really work together to achieve those different and sometimes competing aims.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, we're often operating underwater, water scarce environments, and so really making sure that you get the most out of every drop is really important. Maybe just continue on this theme. I might bring the other Andrew Reynolds, back into the conversation. I guess one of the sort of key parts of both the Water Act and the Basin Plan is this idea of managing water for a range of different outcomes and objectives. Whether it's about providing sufficient, reliable water supplies for communities and towns, providing, or enabling productive water-dependent industries such as irrigation, and of course enabling healthy and resilient ecosystems. So that's, I guess, at the high level. But Andrew, can you maybe help us understand practically how do those sort of high-level objectives translate into operational decisions on the ground on a day-to-day basis?
So our whole water management system is sort of underpinned by a series of entitlements, and so people or entities have a right to use the water that they hold as entitlements for the purposes that they see fit, and everyone rightly wants to maximise the outcomes they can get from their share of a finite pool. And with that, sometimes there are competing objectives about how things are operated. Environmental water holders, for instance, hold a very large and very valuable pool of water. And to maximise the value they get from that in an environmental sense means that they want to be able to use that water multiple times as it moves through the system. So it's released from storage, might flow into the forest. Some of it is evapotranspiration, some of it seeps into the ground, and some of it returns to the river. And that portion that returns to the river, then they would seek to use that again further downstream for another environmental benefit. And so tracking that water through the system is important to maximise the benefit they get from it. An irrigator, somewhat differently, typically wants to have their water delivered to their pump. They pump it out, use it on their property, and that's that. So this concept of being able to maximise the value you get from the entitlement that you hold is an important one. And anything that sort of impacts on one entitlement holder versus another is often seen as a negative. Now, in managing the river system, things change. And so with the best intents of achieving all of the outcomes people want, the best plan doesn't always go exactly that way. You know, you get a burst of hot weather, you get a rainfall event, there's a bit more water or there's a bit less water in the system. And so working through what is the best outcome, both in planning up front and then managing as the event unfolds, requires a lot of collaboration. And the river operators sit at the nexus of that. They facilitate a lot of those discussions. They get the views of what people would like or entities would like to have happen, and have to then adapt the plan and can continue to adapt throughout the season from year to year, learning as things occur and making changes. I think over time that relationship and that approach has matured a lot. It's still got a way to go, but we now often work with environmental water holders where they can articulate an overall objective they're trying to achieve and then provide a bit of flexibility for river operators to make adjustments as the event unfolds. But there has to be limits around that, because environmental water holders, like other entitlement holders, are responsible for the outcomes achieved with their water, and they can't just allow it to be, used by anyone for any purpose. And so that collaborative relationship is really important. But it's also important to know that things can change quickly, and so the time to work through issues, and adjust sometimes has to happen quite quickly, and that can strain some of those conversations a little bit. So the importance of a very strong collaborative relationship and an understanding of the competing objectives through all those players is a really important thing that has developed well and continues to develop.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think that's a theme that I've heard come through a lot of these different webinars, is just the importance of collaboration, the importance of these deep trusting relationships, and how that underpins so many decisions. So it's really great to sort of see that sort of happening here as well. Thanks. Serena, maybe sort of staying a little bit on this theme. So you've been, of course, interviewing operators and other stakeholders, and hearing a lot about the decision environment and the different factors that go into decision making. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of those factors are that shape water delivery decisions?
Sure. So part of the research has been trying to understand the systems of decision making around water systems operations. So in other words, understanding how operators make decisions. So that includes the procedures, the decision criteria they both explicitly and implicitly consider. So through this engagement, especially the interviews, we've identified a huge range of factors that shape decisions. And so to describe this, we proposed a typology that characterized these factors, so covering 5 categories. So this typology is illustrated in a pinwheel diagram, which I'll show. And so at the top, we have governance factors, which provide the rules and structures at both the Commonwealth and state government level, as well as the organisational level. So these factors determine what options are allowed, which are incentivised or discouraged through various policy instruments. So the basin plan being the key legislation for water management across the basin. Next, we have internal drivers. So this includes the goals, the values or ethos, and risk profiles of organisations and individuals. And this influences how they interpret information or perceive the problem space, how they respond to uncertainty and weigh up or prioritise different options or trade-offs. Next, we have the social setting of the water deliveries, and that creates the expectations and pressures that shape what decisions feel socially, culturally and politically acceptable. So for example, meeting community expectations is fundamental to securing a social licence to operate, which then underpins the organisation's reputation and long-term legitimacy. There are also the relationship between operators and stakeholders, which define their capacity to work collaboratively and coordinate actions across the system. So this is what Andrew Reynolds was describing just earlier, that collaboration. Next, we have the informational factors. So that includes the access to information, uncertainty in data and knowledge, and communication and transparency. So these factors shape decisions in terms of how the problem and potential solutions are both understood and interpreted by operators. So information can be in the form of data, knowledge, and models. And in river operation context, it includes not only information that represents the hydrology, climate, and environment, but also information on preferences and priorities around water use, uncertainties and assumptions, and the rationale for choices. There's also, lastly, the operational capacity category, which describes capacity in terms of both physical capacity of the river or channel system and the competency and resource capacity of the individual or the organisation. So the physical capacity includes the volume of water or in the rivers or channels, what they can carry before overtopping or flooding or other risks may occur, storage capacity, the flow capacity of infrastructure, travel time between supply and offtakes, the connectivity or the physical layout of the channel system, and climate conditions. So the skills and competencies of the personnel also play a part in shaping decisions, as well as the resourcing of people in the organisation. So these decision factors don't neatly align with the categories, so with many extending across the category boundaries. And there are also strong interdependencies among many of the factors. So, for example, the basin plan would clearly sits within the governance category, but also has informational aspects, so related to monitoring, evaluation, the annual reporting, the reviews and the consultation and transparency of data. It also covers parts of the operational capacity, so through the constraints relaxation program. So what our research has been indicating is that to achieve multiple benefits in water deliveries, we need transformation across all 5 categories to reduce uncertainties for operators, manage risks, and support them in making decisions that generate co-benefits for others. And we can then apply that thinking to the basin plan and suggest that for the basin plan to achieve its objectives, there's a lot that needs to progress across the system and at all levels. And some of those critical factors are outside the scope of the legislative and policy framework set by the basin plan. So adding to the complexity of this decision-making environment, we have the highly dynamic context that the water systems operation sits within. So with the climate variability, the changing demands and behaviours in society, as well as the increasing prominence of environmental water and cultural water, which is changing how deliveries are planned and implemented, as Andrew had discussed earlier. So operators are working in a very complex and uncertain space.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Serena. And I think it's very clear, all the different dimensions of that, that diagram really shows that very nicely. And, also I think you're thinking about sort of how it relates to, the basin plan, and some of these things are outside of the basin plan, but also important. Maybe continuing, another question, just to follow up with you. You've mentioned uncertainty and risk, a few times, and actually that was mentioned by the other panelists. I think Andrew Reynolds sort of really highlighted, some of the key uncertainties sort of earlier on as well. And those sort of come through as 2 kind of key parts of that typology. Can you provide a little bit more information on the sorts of, I guess, uncertainty and risks that are of most concern to operators, and sort of talk us through that risk landscape a little bit further?
Sure. So I did mention a few of the different uncertainties faced by operators earlier, and Andrew Reynolds also talked about a few of them. But we can probably boil the main ones down to uncertainties associated with water availability, water demand, transmission losses, and the outcomes of delivery options. So in relation to the basin plan, water availability is probably the most common uncertainty discussed. So in terms of rainfall and inflow uncertainties, so the SDLs could be considered a form of risk management that caps extractions to buffer against climate variability and other uncertainties. So in the water systems operational context, operators generally work on shorter timescales. So as Andrew Reynolds described in the beginning of the panel discussions, operations is about trying to get the right amount of water in the right place at the right time. So river operators need to release water from dams and storages in advance to meet future demands downstream. So this means anticipating demand and transmission losses, as well as water availability, which can vary over time depending on rainfall and factors like evaporation. And that level of uncertainty depends on the time, whatever the specific water delivery or transfer is. So for including how far it has to travel. So that example along the Murray from Hume Dam, that's a really long travel distance, and also there's the complexity of the channel network it has to travel through. So some transfers can take a few days, whereas others, like the example, could take several weeks. And so the greater the distances between supply and offtake means it's a lot more difficult to forecast demand, inflows and losses. So the other important uncertainties that are especially critical when thinking about multiple benefits are those around the outcomes of delivery options. So in other words, what are the potential benefits or disbenefits associated with the different delivery strategies? So these can include social, cultural, ecological and economic outcomes. So for example, could releasing a certain volume over a certain period for one purpose incur benefits or risks to others? So the two critical risks in water deliveries that have been raised again and again in our project discussions have been those around, so the insufficient water to meet demand. So in other words, shortfall risks and flooding risks. So this brings into play the risk profile of individual operators or their organisations. So these risk profiles, that they can stem from past experiences, expertise and confidence, personal psychology or organisational culture, but it's also anchored in community or stakeholder expectations and the potential consequences of adverse outcomes. So a risk profile then reflects not only internal depositions, but also the broader context in which the decisions are made and the stakes involved. So our discussions have indicated that government or state-owned organisations typically have a lower tolerance to risks, so as they often bear the burden of liability if things go wrong. So their decisions tend to be more conservative, prioritising safety and compliance to avoid litigation or reputational damage. So the challenge for operators is making decisions faced with uncertainties, with some of these uncertainties being reducible, so with better data and knowledge models as well, but other uncertainties that cannot be eliminated, for example, those related to the dynamics of climate variability, ecological response, or even human behaviour, they remain inherent to those systems.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there in that answer, you know, all these different types of uncertainties, and you can see the challenges that operators have to grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And I guess the situation is also quite fluid, you know, literally, but you know, changing sort of day by day as there's sort of different flow environments and demands change and so forth. I might throw the next question to Andrew Weston, because I think this sort of relates to some of the work that you're doing in terms of the sort of tools and things that we can kind of make available to actually support these decisions. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how we can help facilitate decision making through better tools?
Yeah, so operators have for a long time been using models of how the river system works, how long it will take water to move down through the system, what losses there might be along the way, etc. So they can make predictions of the impacts of decisions. Monitoring systems are, of course, critical in that, so that you know whether things are staying on track. But as we've moved forward, I guess some of the work we're doing at the moment in the CRC projects are really trying to take some of those to the next step. So one area we're working on is control systems and developing those in a way that's applicable to rivers. That they're widely used in the distribution channel networks nowadays. Now, I think rivers are quite a different environment to work in, so the solution there would be quite different. But bringing a formal control system in perhaps lets you explore more options. It more formally manages some of that uncertainty, and it can also probably protect against some risks such as corporate memory, Because one of the critical tools that experienced river operators use now is actually just their knowledge of the system, and how the system might respond to different releases. Of course, if people leave the organisation, it leaves you at risk of losing that particular tool. So we are looking at more formal control systems. We're also looking at some tools to help out with environmental water management. So particularly where you're putting environmental water onto floodplains, where we can build really detailed hydraulic models nowadays, but they take a very long time to run. So we're trying to work to bring those simulators to a point where we can get detailed inundation patterns in a matter of an hour or a couple of hours, and that will help environmental water managers really look at different more nuanced ways of getting water onto river floodplains. So I guess they're some of the key tools in the pipeline at the moment.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I'd like to make some of this conversation a little bit more concrete. So I might bring Andrew Reynolds back into the discussion. So we heard about, I guess, the challenge of delivery of irrigation water and delivering it when it's needed. And Serene sort of talked about shortfall risk. And of course, that can be particularly challenging when you've got some quite extreme weather conditions, and the recent sort of heat wave that we had that sort of caused a demand spike in Sunraysia might be an example of this. So Andrew, can you maybe help us understand what are some of the issues that operators are facing when trying to meet demands under those sort of very extreme conditions?
I guess that's a really good example in terms of the shortfall risk. It's been explored quite a bit over recent years, but fundamentally the river's got a finite capacity. It's only so much water you can get through the river network, and it takes time for water to make its way down through the system, as I said earlier on. And so the risk of a shortfall potentially emerges where there's a spike in weather conditions that sees demand higher than the volume of water that's available in the river, and that water's probably been released from storage 2 or 3 weeks prior. And so within the Murray system, there are limited other opportunities to top up the flow from other sources and to do that quickly. And so river operators are faced with the challenge of sort of looking at weather forecasts and understanding what demands might be. But in the event that there is a sort of a sudden spike in hot conditions that increases the loss of river water from the river, or increases demand substantially, there's the risk that there's not enough water available in the river to meet all those demands, and that would mean that some of the entitlement holders would not get all the water that they would like, and at key times of the season for irrigators, that can be really detrimental to the performance of their crops. So it is an exercise in risk management, and over time there's been a range of ideas and techniques have been developed to try and mitigate the potential of a shortfall in terms of keeping it flow in the river up a little bit. If that water's not used, putting it in Lake Victoria, that's been a long held action, but also raising weir pools, for instance, to store just a little bit more water closer to where that demand might emerge, so that you can top up the river flow more quickly if indeed that's necessary. Some of these things, they come at a cost, like that's not necessarily the most efficient way to operate the river. And if that water's not required, some of it potentially is lost. So there's a range of challenges. And as we try to do different things in the river system, put water onto floodplains, move that water through the system, use it multiple times, other risks around water quality and potential for black water or those sorts of things start to emerge. And so river operators, along with environmental water holders and others working in this space, are all really trying to understand those risks, build knowledge over time, start to do more ambitious things, but not go too far until they understand the implications. And some of the tools that the CRC is seeking to develop and support will be really valuable in scenario planning. Now, when we talk about risk management, understanding the risks that you're exposed to means you need to understand the range of inputs and outcomes that might occur and examine those. And some of these tools that enable that to be looked at in a more timely way will be really, really valuable to help us be able to do things that are a bit different to what's been done in the past.
Yeah, great. Great, thanks. So let's stay on the topic of risks, and I might bring in Andrew Weston again to this. So we spoke, the previous answer was really about shortfall risks, but there's also, I guess, risks of floodplain inundation and so on, which actually is sometimes a desirable outcome in terms of environmental flow management. But there's also, I guess, sometimes constraints that mean it might not be possible either to get the environmental outcomes needed or that there's other risks associated with inundation. So can you maybe sort of elaborate on some of these constraints? And I mean, I guess also we've sort of known about constraints for a while. So what will be needed to make some tangible progress on addressing these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. If you imagine you're an environmental water holder and you're wanting to put water on a floodplain, that really means you're flooding parts of the river system. Now, further upstream or even downstream, that might mean that would require some inundation of private land, and that's a real tension. Okay, so one of the constraints that people talk about is the ability, or otherwise, to be able to deliberately flood private land. And of course, there's a lot of negotiation, etc., required in that. There's a tension between a communal outcome, if you like, and the desires and rights of an individual as well. You might be in a situation where you've got agreement of nearly all the stakeholders along the river, but there's perhaps one or two holding out for whatever reason. So I think some mechanisms to really finalise those negotiations, etc., around constraints. That has been a really difficult challenge in the last 10 years of the plan, getting those constraints relaxed. I think it's something that eventually the plan will have to think about how to deal with the cases where there are perhaps one or two holdout people or organisations. Of course, there's got to be fair compensation and all of that sort of thing that goes along with that. Some other constraints are to do with infrastructure, flooding bridges, etc., and spending some money or providing alternatives is not obvious option there. But you've got to be able to, you've got to have the budget to invest, I guess. So they're some of the new challenges with environmental water, and particularly where you're trying to get those higher flows into systems.
And I think this goes back to comments earlier in this session, really about the sort of the changing needs of operators, and that environmental water, I guess, creates some new challenges that the infrastructure might not have been designed for, or the system is still learning to cope with.
And risks,
Yep.
like both Serena and Andrew have talked about in the past. The risk is it goes higher than you intended. And you've got more extensive flooding. So
yeah, exactly. So you're not just managing flooding; you're managing the uncertainty that you don't know exactly what the outcome necessarily might be, because there might be a rain event or something else, that could increase the amount of flooding that you.
Absolutely.
And then the question is who's responsible, and you can sort of see it all going from there. I'd like to, again, shift gears now and really zoom in to, I guess, mix metaphors a little bit, but really go into what this might mean for the Basin Plan review that's currently underway. Before I do this, I do want to just have a quick reminder to put any questions into the Q&A, so that we will have hopefully a bit of time for discussion towards the end. So if you do have any questions that any of the responses have triggered for you, or anything to do with river operations, please use that Q&A function. Andrew Reynolds, starting with the basin plan as it's currently written, so the current version, how much does it actually talk about matters that are directly relevant to river operators?
So the basin plan sort of sets a whole lot of objectives about things that we would like to achieve that potentially were not being achieved prior to the basin plan. The actual rules for how the river is operated, the obligations on river operators, how water is shared within the system, those sorts of things, they substantially sit outside the basin plan. But the two, in things like the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement and subsidiary documents to that statement of obligations, the specific objectives and outcomes and things like that. But they all have to work in concert. And I guess one of the challenges has been is understanding and finding ways that the existing rules, within the existing rules that are established, to be able to achieve the outcomes that the basin plan and envisages. And so that's a continual evolution, and ultimately some of the rules will eventually probably need to be modified and changed. And that can happen, but change often comes with upside and downside depending on your viewpoint, and so those sorts of changes take some time to negotiate. And when they're contested, sometimes the status quo is easier to preserve than to get the change to occur. And so the basin plan, I think, is a great vehicle to put these things on the table, and the implementation of the basin plan over time has seen many things achieved that probably we didn't anticipate we'd be able to do under the existing rules, and we've found ways to do it. But as I say, the basin plan, it sort of sets some objectives. It does require some things to be changed. It brings to the fore critical human water needs and the need to set aside water to make sure in very dry times that's prioritised. That didn't exist before the basin plan. So there are some things that are in the basin plan, but there are other things that are managed within other instruments outside of that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Maybe now transitioning to sort of what might be contained in a future incarnation of the basin plan, and this is a question for Andrew Weston now. So the discussion paper itself talks a lot about a bunch of different issues that are, either somewhat or actually potentially quite heavily linked to operational decisions, whether it's sort of coordination or integration of environmental water delivery through operations, whether it's floodplain inundation, responding to native fish decline, managing water quality. They all sort of connect with the operational environment. How do you see these issues developing, I guess, in a future iteration of the basin plan?
So some of those issues are going to get accelerated by climate change. We've just seen the heat waves down in Sunraysia. Often in those sort of conditions, you've got issues around algal blooms, etc. as well. And the operation of the rivers in general will probably have a wider range of issues to respond to. I think also we're still in this learning environment around environmental watering, and if we could move to a situation where operators are perhaps a little more enabled to take some risks, to try things out, to learn from them, to try things that they think will lead to synergies, and have a risk envelope that is enabling that to have an appetite for risk rather than an appetite for conservativeness. I think as a principle that would be good to address in the new plan. Another thing, in a lot of our conversations with different stakeholders around the river system, there's all sorts of conversations that happen often in a bipartite way rather than perhaps involving all stakeholders at once. And I think at times there is a bit of a lack of transparency, or at least we hear people complaining about a lack of transparency. So I think some principles around transparency and trying to to enable operators and others to really make clear what their reasoning behind decisions is, and that I think helps with the experimental aspect, where you can see that the whole system, everyone involved in it, is doing their level best to get good outcomes. The decisions were made on a good basis, but sometimes uncertainty comes back to bite, and just the transparency, I think, enables that to be a little more palatable than if decisions are not transparent.
Yeah,
I think, and there's one other issue that comes up, and that is the power of entitlement holders versus all the other stakeholders in the river system. So that's something that will, I'm sure, continue to involve in the way operators make their decisions.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? So what do you mean? What are some of the outcomes that come from that?
So entitlement holders have a right to, order water at certain times, etc. At the moment, there's very, very little cultural water that's actually under entitlement. So a native title, native title's not the right terminology here, but Indigenous ways of Indigenous people getting more of a say in water management, ways of recreation groups and others getting more of a say in operations. I know that that's all brought in, and the operators do their best, but there is quite a range of power differentials in the system.
Yeah, absolutely, and I guess that's unavoidable to some degree, isn't it? Power differentials.
It is, yes.
How does it get managed, and how does the legislation actually enable good outcomes is critical. Serena, back to you. And again, before I ask my question, Serena, I have noticed that there's no questions into the Q&A. So please, if anyone has any questions, please throw them in. But a question for you, to help sort of draw some of the threads together from this discussion. The research project that you're leading is, of course, focused on achieving multiple benefits from river operators. Could you maybe leave us with a sort of sense of what the opportunity is before us if we were to get this right, if we were to sort of really improve how we achieve multiple outcomes for our river operators? What would that look like?
Sure, thanks, Seth. So the Multiple Benefits Project is set out to provide a blueprint of how water delivery systems can be managed for multiple benefits. So this includes the governance, procedures and tools that are required to facilitate this transformation in water deliveries across the basin. So as we've delved deeper into the various case studies, we've learned a lot about the challenges and uncertainties faced by operators and other stakeholders. And so the crux of the problem is the sharing of benefits, disbenefits and risks in deliveries across stakeholder groups in a highly dynamic context where water availability is becoming increasingly variable. So to add to this complexity, we have different stakeholder groups who not only use and value water differently, but also see and understand water in different ways. There's also the power differentials, which Andrew just mentioned. So, but amongst the web of challenges, so we are seeing a desire across operators and other stakeholders to identify the synergies, generate co-benefits for others. So that includes operators wanting to know how they can better support ecological and cultural outcomes. Also, there's been a strong desire for all parties to bridge some of those language and communication barriers and learn from each other and work together towards shared goals. So there's obvious tensions as well. So again, ones that Andrew Weston had raised, and we are exploring different opportunities and barriers that exist to facilitate multiple benefits. So several of the key enablers we are finding are not within the strict bounds of water systems operations. So they include, for example, having good relationships and trust among stakeholders. So Andrew Reynolds talked earlier about having that collaborative relationship. So having clear institutional rules and structures to support shared goals and risks, and also aligning water deliveries with other critical management activities. So such as aligning environmental flows with land management and invasive species management to strengthen environmental outcomes. So we're also working on tools that can help reduce uncertainties for operators and help them make better informed decisions. So if we can get this right, it would hopefully lead to water systems operations achieving greater outcomes across the communities in the basin.
That's great, and I think that definitely sounds like a really good reason to get this right and do everything we can to support river operators. I might draw Andrew Reynolds you back into the conversation. I guess you've had a whole wealth of experience in this space from different lenses, including through the MDBA. If you can cast your imagination forward, a decade, and sort of imagine, we've tackled some issues, maybe haven't. How can you imagine this landscape being different? Do you have any sort of thoughts about what might change, over the course of the next decade?
I think one of the things, and before I look forward, I look back a little bit. We have adapted and we've achieved a lot collectively, achieved a lot with environmental water and changed how the system is operated in ways that we probably didn't anticipate even 20 or 30 years ago. And it's been incremental steps. And I think that's what I would expect to see going forward. A level of ambition to make improvements and seek these co-benefits and seek ways of getting multiple benefits. But as Andrew Weston said, transparency in the information about what's being tried to do, how decisions are made that enable us to push the boundaries a little bit and test things, but also trust from communities that will sneak up on the problem. We'll try something, we'll see how it goes. If it works well, then next time we'll go a bit further. It's not about trying to take a really big step all at once, and potentially getting things wrong. And I think there is a bit of fear in the community at times about, how much could this change, and there's uncertainty around what the change might look like. But I think through these collaborative relationships and transparency and information and better tools that enable us to explain what we're trying to achieve, then those incremental improvements will happen. In a decade from now, I'd like to hope that, constraints in some form will have been relaxed and the ability to get water onto floodplains is greater than it is today, because that's probably the biggest step change that will occur in the environmental health of the basin. But there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed to facilitate that, and it's quite right for communities to be concerned about how that plays out. And it's been a vexed problem for some time, but I would hope we don't lose the ambition to pursue those things, and ultimately at some point down the track that we will have achieved some of those things that were, the vision of the basin plan as it is now, but are yet to quite be achieved.
Fantastic. I think that's a really good sort of aspiration, for the decade ahead. I might start wrapping up now with a closing question. I'm going to ask the same question to all three of you, which is just very briefly, maybe in a sentence or a couple of sentences. And I'll start with Andrew Weston on this. What would be your single most important call to action in terms of the Basin Plan review?
Oh, look, I think it would be support for that transparency and the ability for to experiment and adapt in perhaps a little bit more forthright manner than we've seen.
Thanks very much. I think that's two rather than one. Transparency and experimentation and adaptation, but they're both very important. So thank you for that. Serena, how would you go at tackling that question? What would be your single most, or following Andrew, you can maybe have more than one, important call to action for the Basin Plan review?
So for me, it would be about adopting a broader systems approach that considers your ecological, cultural, social and economic and governance factors together, as well as the land, water and ecosystems. So recognising how strongly intertwined and interdependent all of these components are. That's
great. And you did stick to one, but I guess when you talk about a systems approach, it's a very wide wide-ranging call to action, but also very important. And I think it just shows, you know, and this came through all the different things that everyone's talking about, the interconnectivity and the different, you know, the tensions that are constantly being balanced in these operational decisions. Andrew Reynolds, the last word goes to you. What would you sort of call out as your single most important call to action?
I think for me, I'd hope we don't lose ambition because we feel like we've achieved a lot already. The Basin Plan is a vehicle for continuous improvement. I think principles, establishing the principles about what we want to do, but providing flexibility for adaptation and evolution over time remains really, really important. So, yeah, I think this is a journey. We've been, you know, delivering irrigation water for 100 years. We've been delivering environmental water for 20 or 30, and the Basin Plan is the vehicle that sets us up to, you know, to continue to evolve, you know, and get the balanced outcomes that we seek.
Great. And yeah, so I think the principles approach seems to be, you know, coming through as very important in that sort of instrument. And I like that sort of idea of not losing the ambition that we sort of had when first sort of, you know, putting all this architecture together. So three really great responses from our three panelists. So I'd like to invite everyone to please thank Serena and our two Andrews, Andrew Reynolds and Andrew Weston, for a really engaging set of your on, as you can see, a really important issue around how we manage water across the basin. Really appreciate your comments and thoughts. This is the penultimate webinar. There's one more left, but a very important one, realising First Nations leadership in basin management. This is a few weeks away, 21st of April, so about 3 weeks from now, a little bit over 3 weeks from now, and that'll be chaired by Professor Troy Meston. So make sure you don't miss that. That'll be a very, very fascinating webinar, I am sure. Otherwise, thank you all for joining in, participating. Thanks again to our three panelists, and I wish you a very good day ahead.